The steady hum of the city's evening rush filled the air, the sun casting its last golden rays over the skyline. Streets buzzed with purpose as people hurried home, their minds occupied by their own lives. On the edge of this cacophony stood a boy. His name was Caleb. Caleb, a wiry 13-year-old with skin kissed by the sun and eyes too old for his years, leaned against a lamppost. His clothes were worn and patched, his sneakers scuffed and barely holding together. In his hands, he clutched a small, tattered sign that read, "Hungry, anything helps." People passed him by, their eyes averted or their faces twisted in pity or disdain. Caleb had long learned to silence the pangs of hunger gnawing at his belly, replacing them with the stoic resilience that few his age possessed. But as the minutes turned into hours, even his determination began to waver. "Please," he murmured hoarsely as a woman in a sleek red dress approached. She was adorned with glinting jewelry, her posture exuding wealth and confidence. "Just a little help, ma'am." The woman froze mid-step, her gaze locking onto Caleb. Her lips curled downward in disgust, as if his very presence offended her. "Don't you dare come near me," she snapped, clutching her designer bag tightly. "Do you know how much this dress costs? More than you'll ever see in your miserable life." Caleb flinched but held his ground, his eyes meeting hers with quiet defiance. "I'm not asking for much, just enough to get something to eat. I can work for it, clean your car, carry your bags, anything." The woman let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Work? You? Look at you, filthy and worthless. You'd probably just steal from me." A few onlookers paused, their curiosity piqued. Some took out their phones, eager to document the unfolding scene. Caleb's cheeks flushed with humiliation, but he refused to let his eyes drop. "You don't know me," he said softly. "You don't know what I've been through." The woman scoffed and turned to leave, but her path was blocked by a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit. His presence was commanding, yet calm, his piercing blue eyes taking in the situation with quiet intensity. "That's enough," the man said, his voice firm but measured. The woman faltered, her expression shifting from disdain to flustered indignation. "I was just teaching him a lesson," she muttered defensively. "These beggars need to know their place." The man ignored her and stepped toward Caleb. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded bill, and handed it to the boy. Caleb's eyes widened as he saw the crisp $50 note. Her eyes filled with tears, and she put her $50 note in the bill. She held it out as the boy blinked at her, and then blinked at her. "Thank you," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible. The man offered a small smile. "Take care of yourself," he said gently. Then, turning back to the woman, he added in a tone that left no room for argument, "You've shown everyone who you are tonight." The woman huffed, her face burning with embarrassment, and quickly disappeared into the crowd. The man gave Caleb one last encouraging nod before walking away, blending into the throng of people. As Caleb watched him go, a strange warmth filled his chest, a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. That night, Caleb found shelter under a bridge, clutching the $50 bill like a lifeline. The man's kindness had stirred something in him, a spark that refused to be extinguished by the harshness of the streets. The next morning, Caleb wandered through the city, his mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in years, he wasn't just thinking about survival, he was dreaming of something more. The next morning, Caleb woke to the muted sounds of the city stirring to life above him. The underpass had served as his shelter for the night, its concrete walls providing little warmth, but just enough security for him to rest. Clutching the crumpled $50 bill in his pocket, he allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. For the first time in what felt like forever, he had a choice. He didn't need to scavenge for food or endure humiliating rejections. Caleb's stomach growled, pulling him back to the present. He resolved to find something decent to eat, maybe even save part of the money for the days ahead. Walking through the city's narrow alleys, he eventually came across a modest diner with a hand-painted sign that read, "Cafe Haven." It wasn't flashy, but it felt welcoming. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The smell of frying bacon and brewing coffee hit him instantly, making his mouth water. A kind-looking waitress behind the counter glanced at him and smiled. "Morning, sweetheart. Grab a seat anywhere you like," she said, her tone light and inviting. Caleb hesitated, unsure if he belonged in a place like this, but her warm expression nudged him forward. He slid into a booth by the window, his eyes scanning the menu nervously. Everything looked delicious, but he was keenly aware of his limited funds. The waitress approached, a notepad in hand. Her name tag read Linda. "What can I get you, hon?" Just some pancakes," Caleb replied, his voice barely above a whisper. And maybe a glass of water?" Linda studied him for a moment before nodding. "Coming right up." As Caleb waited, he noticed the other patrons, construction workers, an elderly couple, and a young woman typing furiously on her laptop. They all seemed absorbed in their own worlds, paying him no mind. It was a relief to feel invisible in a way that didn't hurt. Linda returned with a steaming plate of pancakes, topped with a pat of melting butter and a small pitcher of syrup. "On the house," she said softly, winking at him. "You look like you could use it." Caleb blinked in surprise, gratitude swelling in his chest. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Linda gave his shoulder a reassuring pat before moving on to another table. For the first time in a long while, Caleb ate until he was full, savoring each bite as if it were a luxury. As he left the diner, his spirits lifted. He had a full stomach, a little money left, and a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But the day wasn't over yet. By mid-afternoon, Caleb found himself wandering through a park. It was a vibrant oasis in the middle of the bustling city, with children laughing as they played on swings and joggers weaving between paths lined with blooming flowers. Caleb sat on a bench, watching the world move around him. He felt out of place, but also intrigued by the normalcy of it all. His thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a familiar figure. Across the park, the man who had given him the $50 bill was sitting on a bench, his head bent as he spoke on his phone. He looked different now, less composed. There was a tension in his posture, his free hand rubbing at his temple as if trying to ward off a headache. Caleb hesitated, unsure if he should approach. But before he could decide, a second figure appeared. Margaret, the woman who had glared at him with disdain the day before. She strode toward Henry, her high heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Even from a distance, Caleb could sense her anger. He crept closer, staying out of sight but within earshot. "You've been reckless," Margaret hissed, her voice low but venomous. "Giving away money to strays? What were you thinking?" "It's none of your business, Margaret," Henry replied curtly. "It's my money. I'll do what I want with it." Margaret's expression hardened. "Your money? Don't forget who controls the accounts. I won't have you throwing it away on charity cases." Caleb's hands balled into fists as he listened. The kindness Henry had shown him was genuine, yet this woman was trying to crush it under her heel. "Margaret," Henry said, his voice strained but resolute, "you may control the accounts, but you don't control me." Margaret's lips curled into a cold smile. "Oh, Henry," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "You're far more dependent on me than you realize." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Henry staring after her, a mix of anger and defeat etched on his face. Caleb stepped out of the shadows, his heart pounding. "Mr. Henry?" he called softly. Henry looked up, startled, but his expression softened when he saw Caleb. "You again," he said, managing a faint smile. "What are you doing here?" "I was just passing by," Caleb lied, shifting awkwardly. "Are you okay?" Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm fine, Caleb, just dealing with complicated things." "You don't look fine," Caleb said bluntly. "That woman, Margaret, she's bad news." Henry chuckled bitterly. "You're not wrong about that." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Caleb asked, Why do you let her treat you like that? Henry's expression darkened. It's not that simple. Margaret and I were tied together in ways I can't easily undo. But I'm working on it. Caleb hesitated before speaking again. If you ever need help, I'm good at figuring things out. Henry looked at him, his piercing blue eyes searching Caleb's face. You're a brave kid, he said, but this isn't something you should get involved in. I owe you, Caleb insisted. You helped me when no one else would. Let me return the favor. Henry's lips pressed into a thin line as if he were weighing a difficult decision. Finally, he nodded. All right, but if things get dangerous, you walk away. Promise me that. Caleb nodded, though he wasn't sure he could keep such a promise. Over the next few days, Caleb found himself drawn deeper into Henry's world. The man confided in him bit by bit, revealing a web of control and manipulation orchestrated by Margaret. She wasn't just a partner in his business dealings, she was an anchor, weighing him down with her greed and schemes. Caleb and Henry began to devise a plan. It was simple at first. Gather evidence of Margaret's wrongdoings, document her attempts to siphon funds from the company, and use it to cut her out of Henry's life for good. But as they dug deeper, they uncovered something far more sinister. Margaret wasn't just controlling Henry's finances, she was orchestrating a full-scale takeover. Hidden in the company's accounts were transactions linked to shell corporations, all traced back to her. She was building a financial empire behind Henry's back, one that would leave him penniless and powerless. This is bigger than I thought, Henry admitted one evening as he and Caleb pored over the documents they'd managed to retrieve. If we don't act fast, she'll ruin everything. We can't do this alone, Caleb said. We need someone who can help us take her down. Reluctantly, Henry agreed. With Caleb's urging, they reached out to an old friend of Henry's, a lawyer named Evelyn, who had a reputation for exposing corruption. Together, the three of them began to piece together a case against Margaret. But Margaret wasn't about to let her plans unravel without a fight. As the days passed, her behavior grew more erratic. She began to suspect Henry's defiance, and Caleb often found himself looking over his shoulder, wary of her piercing gaze. One night, while Caleb was returning to the underpass where he slept, he noticed a black car idling nearby. Its windows were tinted, but he could feel the weight of someone's stare. Quickening his pace, he ducked into an alley and didn't stop running until he was sure he wasn't being followed. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. Armed with their evidence, Henry, Caleb, and Evelyn confronted Margaret in her lavish penthouse. The tension was palpable as they presented their findings, laying bare her schemes. For a moment, Margaret's mask slipped, revealing the fear and rage beneath. But she quickly composed herself, her smile returning. You think this will stop me? She sneered. You're nothing without me, Henry. That's where you're wrong, Henry replied, his voice steady. I'm done being afraid of you. Before Margaret could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Evelyn had called the authorities, and within minutes, they arrived to arrest Margaret on charges of fraud and embezzlement. As she was led away in handcuffs, her icy gaze fell on Caleb. You'll regret this, she spat. But Caleb stood tall, unflinching. For the first time in his life, he felt powerful, not because of wealth or status, but because he had made a difference. In the aftermath, Henry kept his promise to Caleb. He helped the boy find a place to live, enrolled him in school, and offered him a part-time job at his company. It was a fresh start for both of them, a chance to rebuild and leave the shadows of their past behind. For Caleb, the journey wasn't over, but it was no longer a solitary one. With Henry by his side, he dared to dream of a future filled with hope and possibility, and for the first time, he believed those dreams could come true. The following morning, Caleb found himself stepping into a world he had only ever seen from the outside, a world of polished marble floors, gleaming glass windows, and an atmosphere of quiet power. Henry had invited him to his office, a sleek building that towered above the city like a monument to ambition. The boy's heart raced as he entered the lobby, where professionals in suits moved with purpose and efficiency. It's a much better package. Like I said before, I'm the only one with money, and no one took the time to help me remove my restraints. Caleb, over here. Henry's voice broke through the din, and Caleb turned to see him waving from the reception desk. The man was dressed in his usual sharp suit, but his expression was softer than usual, tinged with gratitude. You made it, Henry said, resting a hand on Caleb's shoulder. I wasn't sure if you'd want to come. I want to help, Caleb replied, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. What do we need to do? Henry led him into a private elevator, and as the doors closed, the boy felt a pang of nervousness. We're meeting with Evelyn today, Henry explained. She's found more evidence against Margaret, but we need to be careful. Margaret has friends in high places, and if she catches wind of what we're doing— I get it, Caleb said, his jaw tightening. We'll be careful. The elevator opened onto a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Evelyn was already there, a formidable woman with short-cropped silver hair and an air of quiet authority. She greeted Henry with a firm handshake before turning her sharp eyes on Caleb. "Oof, you're the boy Henry's been telling me about," she said, her tone neutral but curious. "You've got guts, I'll give you that." Caleb nodded, unsure how to respond. Evelyn wasted no time diving into a detailed explanation of their plan. She laid out the evidence they had gathered, a tangled web of forged documents, fraudulent transactions, and shell corporations that all led back to Margaret. It was overwhelming, but Caleb listened intently, determined to understand. We need one more thing," Evelyn concluded, her gaze settling on Henry, a direct link between Margaret and her offshore accounts. Without it, she could argue that this was all the work of someone else. Henry frowned, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. That won't be easy. Margaret keeps everything important locked in her private study at home. Then, that's where we need to go, Caleb said, surprising both adults with his boldness. Absolutely not, Henry replied immediately. It's too dangerous. I'm smaller, Caleb argued. I can get in and out without being noticed. You said it yourself. This is the last piece of the puzzle. We can't stop now. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, impressed by Caleb's determination. The boy has a point, she said, but it's risky. If Margaret catches him, he won't. Caleb said firmly, I'll be careful. That night, Caleb and Henry waited outside Margaret's sprawling estate, hidden in the shadows of a nearby alley. The mansion loomed before them, its windows glowing with warm light that belied the coldness within. Henry handed Caleb a small flashlight and a set of gloves. If anything goes wrong, Henry said, his voice low, you get out of there. Don't try to be a hero. I won't, Caleb promised, though his resolve was already set. He slipped through the gate, his small frame making it easy to navigate the narrow gaps between hedges and walls. Reaching a side door, he used a paperclip Henry had given him to pick the lock, a skill he had picked up during his years on the streets. Inside, the mansion was eerily quiet. Caleb moved quickly but cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. He found the study on the second floor, its door slightly ajar. Peering inside, he saw a desk piled with papers and a laptop glowing faintly in the dark. He crept in, his heart pounding, and began searching the drawers. Most were filled with mundane items, pens, stationery, receipts, but the bottom drawer was locked. Using the paperclip again, he managed to pry it open, revealing a file labeled Offshore Accounts. His breath caught as he flipped through the documents, each one damning evidence of Margaret's crime. Suddenly, a noise in the hallway froze him in place. Footsteps were approaching, slow and deliberate. Caleb's mind raced. He grabbed the file and stuffed it into his jacket, then switched off the flashlight and hid behind the curtains. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Caleb held his breath, praying he wouldn't be discovered. After a tense moment, the footsteps retreated, and he heard a door close down the hall. He waited another minute before slipping out of the room and making his way back to the side door. As he exited the mansion, relief flooded him. He sprinted back to the alley where Henry was waiting anxiously. You did it? Henry said, his face a mix of disbelief and pride. "Let's get out of here," Caleb replied, his adrenaline still pumping. The next day, Evelyn reviewed the documents Caleb had retrieved and confirmed that they were the missing piece they needed. With the evidence in hand, she arranged a meeting with law enforcement officials, who had been eager to take Margaret down but lacked the proof to do so. The final step was confronting Margaret herself. Henry insisted on being the one to deliver the news, with Caleb and Evelyn by his side for support. They arrived at Margaret's office unannounced, catching her off guard. "What is this?" she demanded, her sharp eyes darting between the three of them. "It's over, Margaret," Henry said, placing the file on her desk. "We have everything, the offshore accounts, the forged documents, the transactions. You've lost." Margaret's face paled, but she quickly recovered, her lips curling into a smirk. "You think you can get rid of me that easily?" she sneered. "You don't have the guts to follow through." "We don't need guts," Evelyn said coolly. "We have the law." As if on cue, the door opened and two police officers entered the room. Margaret's composure cracked as they placed her under arrest, her protests falling on deaf ears. Caleb watched as she was led away, feeling a mixture of triumph and relief. In the weeks that followed, Henry's life began to rebuild itself. With Margaret out of the picture, he regained control of his company and began making amends for the damage she had caused. But his gratitude toward Caleb never wavered. "Caleb," Henry said one afternoon as they sat in his office, "I want to offer you something, a real chance, a place to live, an education, a future. You've earned it." Caleb's throat tightened, emotion welling up inside him. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Say yes," Henry replied with a smile. "You deserve it." Caleb nodded, his heart full. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged. Not just to a place, but to a future he could shape with his own hands. In the weeks following Margaret's arrest, Caleb adjusted to his new life. A life far removed from the cold streets and constant hunger he had known. Henry had kept his promise, arranging a small apartment for Caleb and enrolling him in school. It was modest but warm, with a bed, a desk, and a kitchen stocked with food. For the first time, Caleb had a space to call his own. But adjusting wasn't as easy as Caleb had imagined. The world of structure and expectations felt alien to someone who had lived by instinct for so long. At school, he struggled to fit in. His classmates were polite enough but didn't know what to make of the quiet boy who seemed much older than his years. He often found himself alone, his thoughts drifting back to the life he had left behind. And Henry, sensing Caleb's unease, took him to lunch one weekend. They sat in a cozy cafe, the kind where the smell of coffee and baked goods wrapped around you like a comforting blanket. "How's school?" Henry asked, his tone light but probing. Caleb shrugged, staring at his sandwich. "It's okay." "Just okay?" Henry pressed gently. "You can talk to me, Caleb. If something's bothering you, I want to help." Caleb hesitated, then finally spoke. "It's different. I don't really know how to talk to the other kids. They've never had to worry about where their next meal is coming from or where they're going to sleep at night." Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. It's a different world. But that doesn't mean you don't belong in it. You have a perspective they don't, Caleb. You've survived things most people can't even imagine. That makes you strong." Caleb looked up, meeting Henry's steady gaze. "I just feel like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not." "You're not pretending," Henry said firmly. "You're growing, and that takes time. Don't rush it." Despite his struggles, Caleb began to find small moments of joy. He discovered a love for books, spending hours at the library, immersing himself in stories that transported him to worlds far from his own. One day, while browsing the shelves, he noticed a girl from his class sitting at a nearby table. She had curly hair and round glasses that slipped down her nose as she read. Caleb hesitated before approaching. "Hey, isn't that the book Mr. Randall assigned for English?" The girl looked up, startled, but her expression softened when she saw him. "Yeah," she said, holding up the book. "I'm Lily. You're Caleb, right?" "Yeah," Caleb replied, sitting down across from her. "I didn't know anyone actually read the assignments." Lily laughed, a genuine sound that made Caleb feel at ease. I like reading. It's like escaping into another world. Caleb nodded. I get that. I've been reading a lot too lately. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing easily. For the first time since starting school, Caleb felt like he had made a real connection. Lily wasn't like the others. She listened without judgment, her curiosity genuine. By the time they left the library, Caleb had a small but growing sense of hope that things might get better. One afternoon, Caleb received an unexpected call from Henry. His voice was tense, a stark contrast to his usual calm demeanor. Caleb, I need you to come to my office, Henry said. Something's come up. Caleb's stomach tightened. Is everything okay? I'll explain when you get here, Henry replied. When Caleb arrived at Henry's office, he found Evelyn already there, her sharp eyes scanning a stack of papers spread across the conference table. What's going on? Caleb asked, glancing between them. Henry gestured for him to sit. We've discovered something troubling. Even with Margaret gone, there are traces of her influence in the company. Some of the shell corporations she used are still active. Evelyn leaned forward, her tone grave. It's possible that Margaret wasn't working alone. There's evidence suggesting she had partners, people who might still be trying to carry out her plans. Caleb frowned, the weight of their words sinking in. What do we do? We need to identify them, Evelyn said, but it's going to take time. And we need to be careful. Whoever these people are, they won't go down without fight. The investigation was slow and meticulous. Caleb spent his afternoons helping Henry and Evelyn sift through documents, looking for any clue that might reveal Margaret's allies. The work was tedious, but Caleb found himself strangely drawn to it. Each small breakthrough felt like a victory, a reminder that even the most carefully hidden secrets could be uncovered. One evening, as they worked late in Henry's office, Caleb noticed something odd in a set of bank statements. A series of payments had been made to an account under the name Orion Holdings, a name that hadn't appeared in their investigation before. Henry, look at this, Caleb said, pointing to the documents. These payments, they don't match anything else we've seen. Henry and Evelyn examined the records, their expressions growing more serious by the second. This could be it, Evelyn said. If we can trace this account, we might find out who Margaret was working with. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Evelyn pulled every string she could to gain access to the account, while Henry used his connections to gather more information. Caleb, eager to contribute, spent hours researching Orion Holdings. What he discovered left him cold. It's a front, Caleb explained during a meeting. The company doesn't actually exist. It's just a name on paper. But whoever set it up used it to move money between accounts. A lot of money. Evelyn nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. That's consistent with what we've found. This is bigger than we thought. As they delved deeper, they uncovered a sprawling network of corruption. Margaret's allies weren't just limited to the company. They had ties to politicians, law enforcement, and even rival businesses. It was a web of deceit that seemed almost impossible to unravel. But Caleb refused to give up. He had seen firsthand what greed and corruption could do, and he was determined to help Henry bring these people to justice. Their efforts eventually led them to a man named Victor Kane, a wealthy businessman with a reputation for playing dirty. Victor had been one of Margaret's closest associates, and the evidence against him was damning. But getting to him wouldn't be easy. Victor was well protected, his influence extending into every corner of the city. We need a plan, Henry said as they gathered in his office. Victor's not going to go down without a fight. We have the evidence, Evelyn pointed out. If we can get it to the right people who aren't in his pocket, we can take him down. But we have to be careful, Caleb added. If he finds out what we're doing, he'll try to stop us. Henry nodded, his expression resolute. Then we don't give him the chance. The final showdown came on a rainy evening in a high-rise building overlooking the city. Caleb, Henry, and Evelyn had arranged a meeting with an independent prosecutor, someone they could trust to act on the evidence they had gathered. But as they presented their case, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the room. Victor Kane entered, flanked by two imposing bodyguards. His presence was like a storm, his sharp eyes taking in the room with calculated menace. "Henry?" Victor said smoothly, his voice laced with mockery. "I heard you've been busy." "This ends now, Victor," Henry replied, his voice steady. "We have everything we need to expose you." Victor's smile didn't waver, but there was a glint of danger in his eyes. "You think you can beat me? You're out of your depth." But Caleb, standing beside Henry, refused to back down. "You're scared," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You wouldn't be here if you weren't." Victor's smile faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. The prosecutor, emboldened by the evidence and the courage of the group, called in reinforcements. Within minutes, law enforcement arrived, their presence overwhelming even Victor's bravado. As he was led away in handcuffs, his glare lingered on Caleb. "You'll regret this," Victor snarled. But Caleb met his gaze without flinching. "No," he said quietly, "I won't." In the days that followed, the city began to change. The corruption that had plagued it for so long was exposed, piece by piece. Henry's company emerged stronger, its reputation restored. And Caleb, once an invisible boy on the streets, became a symbol of resilience and hope. As he stood in his small apartment one evening, looking out at the city lights, Caleb felt a sense of peace he had never known. His journey wasn't over, but he was no longer walking it alone. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that the future was bright. As Caleb settled into his new life, he began to think about how he could give back, not just to Henry, who had given him a chance, but to others who were still out there, struggling as he once had. The streets weren't something he could leave behind completely, not when they were filled with kids like him, surviving on scraps and sleeping under bridges. One Saturday morning, Caleb walked through the neighborhoods he used to haunt, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. He wasn't the same boy who had stood on street corners with a tattered sign, but the memories of those days were still fresh, driving him forward. He reached the underpass where he had spent countless nights. It was quieter than he remembered, though the faint sounds of passing cars above still filled the air. A group of kids sat in a circle, their faces wary as Caleb approached. One of them, a girl with tangled hair and a defiant glare, stood up, blocking his path. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp with distrust. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Caleb said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I used to stay here too, I know what it's like." The girl hesitated, her glare softening slightly. "So, what's your point?" "I want to help," Caleb said simply. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a bag of sandwiches and water bottles. "It's not much, but it's a start." The kids exchanged uncertain glances before the girl finally nodded. Caleb handed out the food, sitting down with them as they ate. They were cautious at first, their eyes darting between him and the underpass's exits. But slowly, they began to talk. One boy, younger than the rest, looked up at Caleb with wide eyes. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Nobody cares about us." "I care," Caleb said, his voice steady, "and I know what it feels like to think no one does. But you're not alone, not anymore." The girl who had confronted him earlier, whose name he learned was Mia, studied him with a skeptical expression. "You're different," she said finally. "Most people just look at us like we're trash." "I used to feel the same way," Caleb admitted, "but someone gave me a chance and it changed everything. I want to do the same for you." Over the weeks that followed, Caleb returned to the underpass regularly, bringing food, blankets, and, most importantly, hope. He listened to the kids' stories, learning about their lives and struggles. Each visit reinforced his belief that he couldn't stop at just helping them survive. He needed to help them build a future. One evening, as he walked home from the underpass, an idea began to take shape. The city was filled with abandoned buildings and forgotten spaces, places that could be transformed into shelters, learning centers, or even safe havens for kids like Mia and the others. When Caleb shared his idea with Henry, the man's eyes lit up with a mix of pride and determination. "That's an incredible idea, Caleb," Henry said, "and I'll help you make it happen." They spent the next few months working tirelessly, meeting with city officials, community leaders, and volunteers. Henry used his connections to secure funding, while Caleb focused on designing a space that felt warm and welcoming. A place where kids could not only find shelter, but also rediscover their dreams. The result was The Haven, a sprawling community center located in one of the city's neglected neighborhoods. It featured dormitories, a kitchen, classrooms, and a library filled with books Caleb had personally selected. The walls were painted with bright murals, many of them depicting scenes of hope and resilience. The grand opening of The Haven was a day Caleb would never forget. As kids and families poured in, their faces lighting up with wonder, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Mia and the others from the underpass were among the first to step inside, their eyes wide as they took in the space. "You really did it," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We did it," Caleb corrected, smiling. "This place is for all of us." As The Haven grew, so did Caleb's vision. He began organizing workshops, bringing in mentors to teach everything from math and science to art and music. He wanted the kids to see that their lives didn't have to be defined by the streets, that they could dream bigger, reach higher, and create a future full of possibilities. One afternoon, as Caleb watched a group of kids painting a mural on one of the walls, Henry approached him, a look of quiet pride on his face. "You've come a long way, Caleb," Henry said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You've built something incredible here." Caleb turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me a chance when no one else would." Henry shook his head. "I gave you an opportunity, but you're the one who ran with it. This is your legacy, Caleb." Caleb looked around the bustling center, his heart swelling with gratitude and purpose. For so long, he had fought just to survive, never daring to dream of something more. But now, standing in the middle of a place filled with laughter, learning, and hope, he knew he had found his calling. The streets had taught him resilience, but it was the kindness of a stranger and his own determination that had led him here, and he wasn't done yet. There were still more lives to touch, more dreams to nurture, and more hope to spread. For Caleb, this was just the beginning. Thanks for watching. There's another incredible video waiting for you. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.